Dear God, we stand in awe of your mystery and your wonder. Where we understand you, may we never cease to give thanks. And where we cannot understand, help us to trust and to deepen our sense of dependence on your goodness that may not be evident, but is nonetheless real and deep and abiding. We give thanks for all the people who pitch in and work so hard in abnormal circumstances. I bless you for each who love this church enough to give and to sacrifice. Lead us through this to be stronger and more grateful people. We ask through Christ our Lord. Amen. We're coming to a close of the series that began last September on the miracles of Jesus. And as those of you who've been with us throughout the course know, I intentionally have organized these miracle stories in a kind of ascending scale of significance. We began with the things Jesus did for the material order of reality, the churning water into wine, feeding through the multiplied loaves, stilling the winds. And then we moved on to those more numerous and more incredible miracles, the healings of the body, the healings of the mind, the healing of the spirit. And I intentionally have left to the last of this series the three most dramatic miracle stories that you find in the gospel. That is, the three accounts where Jesus literally brought dead people back to life again. And there is a kind of sequencing in the way I have chosen to deal with these three stories. Last week we talked about Jesus' raising Jairus' daughter. And if you were here, you may remember he was the president of the synagogue in Capernaum. He came to Jesus in great desperation one day and said, "My daughter's at death's door, please come and do something for her." And Jesus starts walking toward their house, and while they're walking, the word comes that she's died. And Jesus says, "Don't be afraid, keep on believing." And so they continue to walk, and so in a matter of minutes, let's say, or at least not more than an hour, when they get to the house of Jairus, everybody has accepted the reality of death. There's this great mourning. And Jesus says, "Why are you weeping? She's not dead, she's sleeping." And with that, he walks into the room with the parents and with three of his disciples. He takes the child by the hand and invites her to rise, to come back to life. And she does that, and then he tells them to give her something to eat. I said last week that there are two ways you could look at that story. Maybe the miracle was diagnosis. Maybe she had not literally died, but they, in those days, had very imprecise ways of determining that. And so maybe what Jesus did was to save her from the horrible experience of being buried alive. That happened many times in ancient culture. And so you could take his words, "She's not dead but sleeping," literally. It's interesting that the more conservative Christians who want to take the Bible literally don't want to take that word literally. I mean, they want that to be metaphorical because they believe in miracles, as I do. But it could be that what Jesus did was save her from being buried alive. Or, as I said last Wednesday night, my own sense is that she really had died, and that Jesus was using the metaphor of sleep as a way of saying to us that just as life is given to us, not because we've earned it or because we can make it happen, but given to us out of the generosity of God, that the best way to understand this experience at the end of life is to think of it like what we're going to do in a matter of hours this very night, where we surrender to unconsciousness, where we become totally without power, and then after a series of hours we are given back our consciousness, not because we make it happen, but because the generous mystery that wants us to be gives us life again. So I suggested last week that sleep could be a way of understanding the way this generous mystery continues to give life in increments again and again. The second story, the one we're going to talk about tonight, is about a man who had been dead probably for anywhere from 12 to 24 hours. Jairus' daughter, a matter of minutes, maybe an hour at most. The second story is a little more dramatic because the man had probably been dead as I say, either 12 to 24 hours. They had to bury people quickly back in that day because the climate quickly began to decompose the body, and so they had to very, very swiftly move to bury people. And we'll read this story and talk about it in length. Next week, I'm going to end the series by the most dramatic of all the resurrection stories, the one found in the 11th chapter of John's Gospel, where a person who had been dead for 4 days is brought back to life. Jesus' good friend Lazarus, brother of Mary and Martha. And you remember when word came to Jesus that Lazarus was sick, he didn't go immediately. And by the time he got there, Lazarus had died. Now, the sequence here is that a few minutes to an hour, 12 to 24 hours, and 4 days, here you have increasing intensities of the miraculous. Now, even today we realize that when death occurs, the echoes of life continue for a while in the body. Death is a process, even though there is a kind of eventual nature to it. My great-grandfather died before my grandfather was born. He was a landowner in Kentucky, a slave owner, but he didn't believe in secession, so he joined the Union Army, which almost kept my mother, Mississippian as she was, from marrying my father when she heard that. But anyway, he was guarding the Mumfortville Bridge in Kentucky, contracted pneumonia, was brought back home and died before my grandfather was born, which meant he never saw his father. The ground was frozen so solid that they had to leave his coffin out in the barn until spring came, and that was several months later. And the story in the family was that my great-grandmother very much wanted to see her husband one more time. So in moving his body from the barn to be buried in the little country cemetery close by, they opened the casket. And what they found is not uncommon. That is, his hair had grown some more, his beard had grown, his fingernails had grown. The reason I'm saying that is there are echoes of life even after the moment of death. But the longer that the person has been dead, the more miraculous, the more incredible it is that the mystery of life would be restored to one that had become a corpse. Tonight I want us to focus on the middle range miracle. And I'd like to read for you the short account that we have. It's only found in one of the Gospels, actually in the 7th chapter of the Gospel of Luke. And this is the way this particular miracle is remembered. Jesus went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went with him. As he approached the gate of the town, a man who had died was being carried out. He was his mother's only son, and she was a widow. And with her was a large crowd from the town. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion for her and said to her, "Do not weep." Then he came forward and touched the bier, and the bearer stood still. He said, "Young man, I say to you, rise." And the dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized all of them, and they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has arisen among us. God has looked favorably upon his people." And the word about him, the word about Jesus, spread throughout Judea and all the surrounding country. In many ways, this little story gives us the essence of what Jesus came to teach us about God. In this little story of human pathos, and then incredible miracle, we get a glimpse into the very heart of God, what God is, how God feels, and what God is able to do. And in this short few verses, in this simple setting of ancient Galilee, you almost have a window, if you choose to use it this way, into the very heart of God. Let's look at the setting. Jesus has been in Capernaum, and he makes his way to the village of Nain, which was actually southwest, about a day's journey. It was just a little bit south of Nazareth, where Jesus had grown up. And as he is walking along with his disciples and a group of people, he encounters a funeral procession coming out of the village of Nain. I realize that the Jewish people back then and even to this day, don't have a solid belief in life after death. And so the death of a beloved individual is a tremendous tragedy. The mourning that took place was down to the depths of their being. They rent their clothes, they wailed, they got flute players to make this shrill, high sound. And so Jesus meets this procession of people who are coming out of the village, and at the head of it are a group of mourners. And then there is a wicker basket called a bier. I need to tell you that in Palestine in that day they didn't use coffins because those were too expensive. They rather simply took the body on this open wicker basket. You've probably seen television pictures in India where before the people are cremated, that they're always carried, the corpse is carried in open air, where you can actually see them. Now in Egypt they did have a sarcophagus, they did have coffins, but not in Israel. And so this funeral procession, and you see the young man who has just died. He's there in full view, and behind him comes his mother, and then all the other people, members of the family, and other people who are in mourning. And in one simple sentence, we are told two things about this situation: that the dead person was this mother's only son, and that she was a widow. Now, some commentators say that all of the pathos of our human situation, vulnerable as we are to loss, all of it is bound up in this one simple scene that is so simply described. If you think about the woman, she was already a griever because she had lost her husband. That meant she had already known what it was to invest affectionately and then to have that form of the relationship come to an end. We also know that in addition to being a griever, that now she, as a female, was alone and without support in that culture. Women in that day were completely dependent on males, either their fathers or their husbands or their sons. There weren't provisions for them to work. Therefore, it was either your father taking care of you or you married well. If something happened to your husband, then your child took care of you. But a woman without any male connection was in a very, very vulnerable position, which meant that this woman had not only experienced grief before and now is experiencing it again, but she was also suddenly faced at the social situation of being totally, totally without resources. I simply also want to point out that in addition to those two things, this woman had to experience what is a profound abnormality, and that is outliving the life of her child. And most of us don't go around talking about it, but we expect our children to bury us. That is the normal sequence of things. And therefore there is something quite out of sync. There is something quite unseemly about a parent living longer than a child and having to take someone who you had expected to grow to fullness, to be a part of your ending of life in helplessness as you were part of their beginning of life in helplessness. And there is something about the natural cycles of life that are badly disrupted when a child dies before a parent. I know whereof I speak. When our little girl was diagnosed with leukemia in 1968, they immediately gave her some medicine that induced a remission. And for 9 months we had great normality. During that period, a new version of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, the great tragedy, came out on film, and it was highly acclaimed critically, and my little girl loved. She was already romantic, though she was just 9 years old. And so we took her one night to see this, and I'll never forget that in the movie, after Juliet dies and before Romeo takes his own life, he's standing looking at her young corpse, and he says, "Death lies on her like an untimely frost, the loveliest flower of all the field." And I remember those words made a deep impression on me, though at that time I was filled with hope that either Laura Lou would be healed or something would happen. But when a little over a year later the battle with leukemia was lost, those were the words that we chose to put on our headstone. death lies on her like an untimely frost, the loveliest flower of all the field. And that could have been said by this mother as well, because something premature had trespassed on the green lawn of this young man. And this mother, who knew what it was to lose a beloved husband, and who now found herself without support in the world, also knew that special kind of grief of having outlived her own offspring. This is the human situation in all its pathos, in quite graphic and profound form. I want you to look now at Jesus' response to this situation that he just happens up on. We have no way of knowing if Jesus knew these people personally. Nain and Nazareth were not far from each other, and back in those days, peasants did know about each other from village to village, so he may well have known them personally. We don't know that detail. What we do know is that when Jesus saw that dear woman in the grips of such incredible sadness and incredible grief, he did several things. Luke says he saw her and he had compassion on her. This is a word that is used again and again to describe Jesus' reaction to human pain. The Greek literally means he was moved to the depths of his heart. What he saw and the pain of it touched and resonated with something deep within himself. And so he saw this situation and he had compassion. Now, you've heard me say many times that the opposite of love is not hate and it's not rage. The opposite of love is indifference. You don't get angry at something that is unimportant to you. Every time you have anger, you at least have some vitality around which there has been some kind of bad expectation. But the opposite of love is this indifference that is simply oblivious to another, does not care about another, simply can turn the other way, as if the other were made of plate glass or if the other did not exist. Now, many times in the Gospel, the disciples were indifferent to human suffering. You remember when the 5,000 were restless and hungry, the disciples wanted to get rid of them. Well, then again, when children were coming and wanting to get close to Jesus, they were anxious to shoo them away. Or when that pitiful woman who'd been hemorrhaging for years reaches up and touches his garment, and Jesus senses something has happened, they wanted to ignore and treat her as if she didn't matter. But indifference was not a part of Jesus' makeup. I think it's so important that we see this word compassion as a profoundly, profoundly descriptive word of the heart of Jesus, which I believe was a miniature of the heart of God himself. Now, it's interesting that the biblical image of God, which always has compassion at the heart of it, was in genuine contrast to the dominant philosophy of that day in Rome, which was Stoicism. And Stoicism is simply the Western variation of the religious vision of Buddhism, which at least a third of the human race embraces. In fact, it is the dominant religion of the Far East. Now, in both Buddhism and Stoicism, the heart of it is a kind of indifference to human suffering. The Buddha says the only way to avoid the terrible pain that you see all about you is get to the place that you just don't care. You are not invested, you're not attached. Get to the place of detachment so that if your child is killed on the way home from school or comes home with all A's, neither would make any difference to you. Isolate yourself from any kind of feeling involvement. Now, the rationale is that if we let ourselves feel the pain of others, then we're no longer in control. That is, there are other realities beside our ego that can control what the shape of our life is. And indifference is a way of protecting ourselves from the pain of other people's lives. But indifference is the opposite of what Jesus was and what Jesus came to show us about God. In a culture where Stoicism was recognized as one of the noblest ways to be, here is a human being who sees another human being suffering, and it breaks his heart. He not only sees her, but he is moved to the depths he has that glorious, glorious quality that is called compassion. Out of that compassion, he says to this woman an astonishing thing: do not weep. That is, don't take this as the last word. I talked last week about how when the word came to Jairus that the daughter had died, Jesus shocked him by saying, don't be afraid, keep on believing, which was his challenge to this common assumption that experiences like death are end experiences where nothing positive can lie beyond. But here again we see Jesus saying to the bereaved mother, do not weep. Then he does something very startling. He stops this funeral procession that is making its way out of Nain into the cemetery. And that was something that took a lot of arrogance to do. I did a funeral this afternoon for dear Felix Drennan's mother. And to just think of what would have happened if on the way out to the cemetery, if I had suddenly stopped and gone into the hearse and tried to raise Mary back from the dead. This is just not something that was commonly expected. But Jesus stops the procession, and then he does something that again is most unusual. With incredible courage, he walks up and he touches the corpse. Let me pause and say that if you read the Gospels carefully, Jesus was incredibly tactile. He was not afraid to touch. He touched lepers who were considered highly contagious. He touched children who many times were felt to be a nuisance to adults. And he even had the courage to touch the corpse of a dead person. Now, that would have made him ceremonially defiled. But notice that both with Jairus' daughter and also now with this young man, he has the courage to touch the lifeless corpse. And then with a kind of incredible authority of life, he says the same word to the young man lying on the bier as he had said to the little girl back at the house of Jairus. My son, arise. And what we are told is that the corpse sat up on the wicker basket which was carrying him, and he began to speak. The one that had called this particular human being out of nothing into being, the one who had given him the gift of life at the moment of his birth, not because he deserved it, but because the generous mystery wanted to give it. That mystery, for reasons of his own, gave that man back an animated sense of life, and a corpse that no longer had the power to breathe and to live was given that back by divine generosity. And then we're told Jesus gave the son back to his mother. I think the thing that I've learned more than anything else in this study of the miracles is that Jesus never did any one of them for himself. There is nothing self-serving about any of the miracles. Jesus is not trying to make a reputation. In fact, more often than not, he begs people not to say anything about it. Every time he performs a miracle, it's because there is a need that lays hold of his heart, and there's a power and a generosity in him that wants to bless and wants to give. And so because he had sensed this mother's incredible pathos, and because what happened to her mattered to him, he gives life back to this dead young man, and then he gives the young man back to his mother, and he doesn't ask for any money, he doesn't ask for any approval. Every miracle is love responding to human need, compassion reaching out to give and to bless. And I invite you to let that be the primal image as you try to think your way into the nature of God. That God is not a need lover, doing what God does to get, to grasp, to try to somehow fill his emptiness. God is gift love and gift lover. Out of the abundance of what God is, God gives. I want to suggest that this little story, which I have just described for you, is one of the best miniature portraits of what the heart of God is like that you'll find anywhere. It brings together the two qualities that I think are distinctive about the biblical vision of God. I've talked about the compassion that Jesus felt when he saw this person of need. And then when he touched this lad, And when the things that happened did happen, here you have a glimpse into the power of God. Now, the biblical religion lives more by narrative and story than by definition and by concept. The closest thing we have to a theoretical definition of God are the words of St. Paul in the book of Romans. He describes God as the one who can make the things that are out of the things that are not. That is, He has the power to create. And He is the one who can cause dead things to come back to life. He is capable of resurrecting when life has gone out. Now, these are two metaphors for the power of God. God is holy, that is, utterly unique, in that God has the power to give life out of nothing and to give life back even in the presence of death. Now, this is the thing that you and I as humans are incapable of doing. We can receive life. Tragically enough, we can take life, but we cannot give life. Only God has that unique power to give the spirit of animation to that which otherwise would not have it. And if you want the clear image of what is the one like who stands behind reality, the Bible suggests that this is one who is totally and fully loving and one who possesses the ultimate of power, the power to create out of nothing and the power to make dead things come alive again. Now, if you just take one of these without the other, you have a very deficient image of God. If God is totally and utterly loving, but is powerless against many of the realities that God faces, then God is a kind of weak and pathetic, though lovable figure. On the other hand, if God is the possessor of all power and yet does not have the heart of love, then that's the making of a tyrant. That is the making of someone to be feared. It is this unique blending of the one who is both love and power, the one who has a heart that wants to help and has all the abilities in the world at His disposal. That is the unique image of God. And what you have in this simple little story is a window into the heart of the eternal. Notice the reactions of the people who witnessed this. They were seized with awe. They were overcome. They could not believe their eyes. And when they did get back their voices, they say, "A great prophet has arisen among us." They say, "Surely God has visited, come near to His people." They had this sense that somehow holiness itself had broken into their lives, and their response was one of incredible, incredible awe. And the little story raises the same question that I closed with last Wednesday night, and that is, what do you honestly believe, honest engine, about this experience of death, this dark at the end of the tunnel, this vanishing point where beyond it we no longer see, we no longer hear, the person that has died simply goes out of the range of our senses. Is this annihilation? Is life as you and I know it in time and space, is that all there is? Or is death, mysterious as it always is this a transition into the next level of God's everlasting love? Is death a way of moving from one schoolroom to another? Is death transition in the everlasting love of the generous God, or is it annihilation? Well, none of us in this room can answer that question by experience. None of us can say from having been there, done that, here is what it is. But this kind of story, and all the stories of the gospel, I think are put here to try to help us believe with all our trusting hearts that the love of God is larger than our 70 in time and space, that the purposes of God are greater than just the time between the womb and the tomb, that God has more for us in terms of loving kindness than what we experience in our life here on earth, and that just as we move from our mother's wombs into another realm called time and space, by the grace of God and God's great mercy, we're given life after death on the same terms that we were given life after birth at the time of our beginning. I cannot prove this to you. I cannot make a scientific theorem of it that's going to be utterly convincing. But I will say to you that the vision that we get from this story, that death is not bigger than God, that the compassion of God and the power of God is greater than all the sadness that we see in the story. I will say to you that this vision does have enough rootage in what we have experienced, I think, to give us honest reasons to hope and honest reasons to live our way into the unknown with a sense of trust. We take what we have experienced and we use this as we try to extrapolate what the unknown is going to be like. The two hints that I think that this vision is true, the two hints are to simply look at the structure of life as we have known it. If you've been to many funerals here at St. Luke's, you've undoubtedly heard me say, because it's my deepest core faith, that what happens to us at the end of our life in history, I believe, is best understood by comparing it to what happens to us at the beginning. We start out as two tiny cells in our mother's body, microscopic. There is a miracle why this sperm and this egg would ever come together, and come together in a way that new life would begin. It is a miracle every time it happens. And from that microscopic beginning, something begins to grow and complexify. We call it a fetus. And after 36 to 38 weeks, in that wonderful place of protection and nourishment, in the center of a mother's body close to her heart, there comes a trauma of separation. From the vantage point of the womb, it is a death. The little fetus is taken from the place it has been nurtured and protected, and it is ushered into a realm that is absolutely and completely different. And what we could say, if we were looking at it only from the womb, is the fetus has died. It has ceased to be as it once was. But that same trauma, looked at from the different angle of time and space, is something we call birth. That means that this fetus has now moved into a new level of existence where things are possible that would never have been possible if the fetus had stayed forever embedded in the mother's body. And so in time and space we grow physically, intellectually, emotionally. We become all kinds of things in this schoolroom that would have been impossible in that beginning place. And this pattern of dying to the smaller when it has served its purpose, that we might be born into the bigger which has a greater purpose for us. This is a pattern that repeats itself again and again and again. And that's what I think you and I can come to trust. This birth-death polarity, this leaving the one that we might be born to the other. I think that is the way the generous God has chosen to give us our lives. And you've probably heard me tell again and again something I heard Rowan House say many years ago at a workshop where I went to his Advanced Institute of Pastoral Studies. And I heard him tell in a meditation about going back to Pittsburgh, where he had begun as a young priest decades before. He'd made several close friendships there. He'd gone on to teach at Virginia Seminary and then to found his own pastoral care agency. But he said that 30 years after he'd started out in Pittsburgh, he went back to do a teaching. And when he was in the church where he had started, somebody told him, one of his dearest friends from years before, a man named Charlie, was in the terminal stages of cancer, didn't have many days to live, told him what hospital he was in, and Rowan had some time. And so he goes and sees his friend Charlie. They had kept in touch with each other across the decades. And he found Charlie right close to death itself, but very lucid and very willing to talk about it. And as Charlie talked about what he was feeling at this moment, he said, "Rowan, I've always wondered what it was going to be like to die, because that's always the certain uncertainty of every one of us." And he said, "Now I'm up close to it. I'm within days of it. And lo and behold, what I've discovered, Rowan, is that it's an old friend in new garb." And Rowan said, "Well, what do you mean by that?" And then he said, it's just like a thing that's been happening to me all my life. He said, when I was 6 years old, my mama came in one September morning out into a career. And he said that process has repeated itself again and again and again. And he said, I've learned something, Rule. Every exit is also an entrance. You never walk out of one thing without walking into another. And then he said, I have every confidence that what is about to happen is that same pattern. I'm about to leave this world of time and space, and I'm about to walk into the next room that God has prepared for me to grow and to love and to be. Newell House said that he was awestruck at the simple metaphors that were undergirding this dying man. 2 days later, Charlie did die. Hal was still in Pittsburgh, so the widow asked him to help with the service. And I heard him say that he went through the burial office that we Episcopalians have that is so powerful and so beautiful. And when it was over, he came down with the rector of the church, and they followed the casket out the aisle, a very heavy, somber, and realistic goodbye. And he says he was trudging up the aisle, it suddenly hit him that Charlie was gone, that the way it used to be and the way it is were very different. And he had this great, overwhelming sense of sadness. And then he said he looked up, and thanks to the fire department, over the back door, just like in here, was an illuminated sign with the 4 letters on it, EXIT. And he remembered what Charlie had said. Every exit is also an entrance. And a flood of hope came back to rural Hal. Now that's taking what we have experienced, using it as we look into what we have not experienced. And I think it is consistent with the vision of God that you find in this little story. The other hint that I think this is true is something that has become more common of late. About 20 years ago, a philosophy professor over in Georgia, a man named Raymond Moody, began to hear stories about people who had physically died and then had come back, had been resuscitated. And he was not particularly versed in this particular part of life, but he got curious about these stories, and he began to go to talk to some of these people. And lo and behold, he discovered that there was a pattern that again and again recurred, even though the details of the story were different. And as he began to collect these stories, it dawned on him that there was some kind of convergence of experience that just might offer a vision of hope. And so back in the early 70s, he published a little book called Life After Life, where he collated 150 accounts of people who in various circumstances had physically died, but then had come back. And the structure that he found in all of these experiences was that they found themselves going through a cool, dark tunnel, and then suddenly they came into light and brilliance. And they many times would encounter religious figures that were meaningful to them, or members of their family that they had loved. And in every case, they said the experience was beautiful, that the experience was one of incredible acceptance, a kind of cleansing and a kind of warming by the light. They went on to say that these people came back without a sense of fear, that somehow the transition between this world and the next, because of this experience, had been made something not fearful, but something they could actually trust and believe in. Well, I read the little book with interest, as I try to be open to all kinds of truth. Not long after that, my one remaining child, my son, went away to college. This was in 1976. When he came home Christmas, he was having a physical problem. We took him to a doctor. And the doctor said he needs minor elective surgery. It is not an emergency. You can wait to spring break. But we really need to care for this surgically. And so when he came home in March, we made the appointment, went down to the hospital. He was to have the procedure that morning, spend the night in the hospital, come home the next day. And though I don't think I'd ever said it consciously, I guess at some level I was saying to myself, surely I've been asked to pay all that a parent should have to pay in terms of losing a child, and so I don't recall being apprehensive at all going into this procedure. 45 minutes after he was in the operating room, both the anesthesiologist and the surgeon came rushing out and said, your son went into cardiac arrest. He must have had some kind of allergy to anesthetic. We had to do some pretty extreme measures, but we did get his heart back to beating, and he's okay, but we can't proceed with the operation because of this. Well, I was absolutely stunned. It had never occurred to me that my other child would die before I did. Well, anyway, we went into the recovery room where he was coming to. And to my great amazement, he said, the strangest thing just happened to me. He said, they took me to the operating room and they were putting me to sleep. And all of a sudden, my head popped out of the top. My personhood popped out of the top of my head like the cork out of a wine bottle. I was a Baptist minister at the time, and I was wondering where he had learned that particular metaphor. But anyway, he says, it was as if I popped out of the top of my head, and I was up on the ceiling, and he said there was all this commotion. I saw my body, and they were running around calling for this and calling for that. They were beating on my chest, and they'd give me an injection, and they were doing this. And I tried to say to him, don't be so excited. It's okay, it's okay. And then he said, I rejoined my body, and that's the last thing I remember. And I said, have you ever read Raymond Moody's Life After Life? And he had not. He knew nothing about this in the usual ways that we get experience. And so we went home from the hospital, and they did some tests. And 2 days later, this time with a measure of courage on my part, he went back into the procedure. This time it was successful. And that became simply part of his experience. But it made a profound impact on me. I had read the book, and now one of my own flesh and blood had had this experience of dying and yet it not being the end of everything. And not long after he'd gone back to school, I had a dream. I've told this before. I told it one Easter, I remember. In my dream, I died, went through this cool, dark tunnel, came out into what has to be called kindly light, accepting, warm, cleansing. I saw no figures, but suddenly there was a voice that had that depth, resonance, that I knew it was the voice of God. And that voice said, welcome, my son, welcome. You are my beloved, my cherished. I welcome you home. And I remember feeling a great, great sense of being accepted. And then the voice said, I want to ask you some questions. And that's when I tensed up. I said, uh-oh, here is where it comes. And the voice said, can you honestly weep for all the mistakes you've made, the hurt you've caused other people? Can you honestly weep that you haven't done life perfectly? And I began to have experience after experience where I remembered the things that I had done that I wished I hadn't done, the moments that I had passed up opportunities that I would to God I had seized. In fact, the whole burden of imperfection, my own simple story, came back with all of its power, and I wept to the depths of my soul because I am sad I haven't done it better than I have done it. When that had passed, the voice said, I want to ask you another question. Can you laugh over all the good experiences you had? Can you laugh at all the good jokes you've heard? Can you laugh at all the mistakes you and other people have made? Can you see the light side of life? And immediately I began to think about all of the things in life that had brought me joy. And I began to laugh to the depths of my being, and it seemed like to me the county light around me was laughing too. And when that had passed, the voice said, let me ask you one more thing. Do you want any more of it? This life that has caused you to weep but has also given you much to laugh about, do you want any more of it? And it dawned on me that there was nothing automatic about the response, that I was being given something but not having something forced on me, that I really did have a choice. And I looked deep into the pain that I knew and the joy that I'd experienced, and from somewhere deep within, I found myself saying, yes, for all of its bittersweetness, I do want some more of it. And with that, the light around me began to vibrate with delight. God said, I am so glad to hear it. Come, ye blessed of my Father, and enter into the joy of the Lord. Enter into the joy that has been prepared for you from the foundations of the earth. Dive deeper in and further on. It was as if I submerged myself in an ocean of light, and then I woke up. I cannot prove to you anything by that dream, except it seems to me consistent with the biblical vision. If we do care about what we've done with our lives, we are going to have to weep. But the weeping is there to teach us and not to condemn us. If we really are halfway grateful, there is much to celebrate already, and will be more to celebrate. And this question of do we want any more of it? It's the question I think the generous one finally has to pose to every one of us. He cannot inject the joy of life into us like penicillin. Though it is given totally beyond our deserving, it is not something that is ever going to be forced on us. And I think these near-death experiences and the way that we see how life moves from letting go the small to receiving the bigger, I think what we do know gives us every confidence in the world to trust that when our time on earth has come to an end, we will not be to the end of everything. I believe the one who raised the widow's son is going to be there touching us. I think he's going to say our names and assure us of our cherishedness. And then he's going to say, do you want any more of it? And I pray, God, out of deep, deep gratitude,